Okay, everybody, I have just about 1 o'clock. I'm going to go ahead and get started. There are a lot of people missing, but maybe they'll trickle in as we go along. And I want to start off by making a few announcements. First of all, this webinar is going to be recorded and archived and put up on YouTube after the training for the benefit of anybody that wasn't able to join us today. We have a mixture of both WISAs and VR staff on the line. So for the WISAs on the line, just want to remind you that you can count your participation in this webinar today towards your continuing education credits for Cornell, if you were certified through Cornell. If you have any questions about how to access your portal or to log in your credits, you can contact Michelle Alvord at msa224@cornell.edu. And Michelle can walk you through how to log in those continuing ed credits. The webinar is going to be about an hour today, so you'll get 1 hour. For the VR staff on the line, there are going to be CRCs available for your participation today. So if that's something that you require, if you're interested in obtaining those credits, just shoot me an email after we're done at Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, .klinger, K-L-I-N-G-E-R, at dars.virginia.gov, and I'll make sure those credits get logged in for you. One last thing, I want to apologize in advance for any technical difficulties we may experience. DARS just recently moved from GoToMeeting for webinars to this Zoom software, and this is my first time using it. Everything seemed to be working fine when I tested it earlier, so hopefully it continues to do so. Okay, so today's training is going to be on living arrangements and in-kind support for individuals who are on Supplemental Security Income, or SSI. And I wanted to do this training because I've gotten a lot of questions recently, both from VR staff and from WISAs, regarding in-kind support. So I thought a little overview might be beneficial to those of you that have some questions. So again, in-kind support only applies to people that are receiving SSI. If people are getting like Social Security disability or retirement benefits, in-kind support does not apply. Just want to take a minute to go through some basic information about payment structures. So if someone is living alone in Virginia or paying their fair share of expenses and living in the household of another, the maximum rate is $735 a month that they can receive in SSI. If somebody is living with others or living independently and getting outside in-kind support, their payment could be reduced to $490. And then a disabled couple who is defined as both individuals are disabled and both receiving SSI is eligible for up to $1,103. And I'll talk about how Social Security defines a client paying their fair share in just a moment. So determine whether or not a client is paying their fair share of expenses when living in the household with somebody else, and whether or not they're subject to the in-kind support. What Social Security is going to do is total up the expenses for the household when it comes to how much it costs to run the household for food and shelter, and then divide that number by the number of people in the household. And I gave you an example here on the handout that I sent out yesterday. So for example, if the expenses for the household for food and shelter are $2,000 a month, and there's 2 people in that household, then each person would be responsible for $1,000. Because a client's share in that situation would be more than their SSI payment of $735, that's an indicator that there could be some in-kind support there. And when I say shelter expenses, it's not just rent and mortgage. Obviously, that's part of it. But Social Security will also look at expenses in operating the household, such as how much each person pays for utilities, if there's property taxes applicable, that sort of stuff all gets lumped into shelter expenses. There's 2 types of in-kind support that I'd like to talk about. The first one is pretty straightforward. Social Security calls that the 1/3 reduction provision. And that applies when a client is receiving SSI and lives in the household with another person, and they don't pay anything for food or shelter. So another person is helping them pay those food and shelter costs. And that could be a parent, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a parent. It could be another relative. It could be a friend. Anybody that they're living with that helps them with those expenses could be considered providing in-kind support to them. So what Social Security will do in that situation is the following. I've given you an example here. Say Joe is an SSI recipient and he lives with his parents, and he doesn't pay them anything for food or shelter costs. So because the parents are providing that for him, Social Security will reduce his SSI payment by 1/3, reducing his SSI payment from $735 to $490. And I've just given you a little example of how that works. So what Social Security would do in a situation where a client is subject to the 1/3 reduction for in-kind support is this. They take the $735, which is the maximum federal benefit rate that they would otherwise be eligible for, and minus $245 from that, which is 1/3 of the SSI payment, or $735. That's how they come up with the $490 figure. So again, the SSI would always be reduced by 1/3 if a client is not paying for food and shelter. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but if you do have any questions, you can type them in the chat box in the end, and I'll address any questions you have after I'm finished. So the next in-kind support is called the presumed maximum value. And this applies when a client is living with somebody, or maybe living in their own household but receiving outside support, but they're not receiving both food and shelter costs. So they're paying something towards the cost of their food and shelter. So in this case, they might not be subjected to the whole 1/3 revision that they would be if they were paying nothing towards their expenses. So if a client is living with somebody and either contributing to food or shelter costs, Social Security looks at their in-kind support in a different way using what they call the presumed maximum value. So the presumed maximum value is the same as the 1/3 productions. So it's equal to 1/3 of the federal benefit rate, which is $245, plus $20. So the presumed maximum value rate, the maximum amount of in-kind support that Social Security could reduce a client's SSI by, is $265. Okay, that's the maximum that they can reduce the check by. But Social Security doesn't count $20 of the in-kind support, which is the unearned income disregard. So really, the maximum amount under the presumed maximum value that Social Security can count is $245. And at first glance, it looks like the 1/3 reduction provision and presumed maximum value are the same, but they're different in the way that the presumed maximum value can actually be refuted, whereas the 1/3 reduction provision cannot be. Clients living with somebody else not paying anything towards food and shelter, their check is automatically reduced by 1/3, and there's nothing they can do to refute that. If they're paying something and the support is counted under the presumed maximum value, then the client can refute the amount of support that Social Security says they're receiving if they can show that the value of the support they get is less than $245 a month. And I've given you an example of how the presumed maximum value works. And I took this example right out of the POMS. So this is an example that Social Security provided. And I wanted to give you an example of two people living together that was receiving in-kind support from outside of a household, because in-kind support is not just the people that you live with that provide support. People that live outside the household can provide in-kind support too. So here's the example. Bernie and Alex Bell are cousins who both receive supplemental security income, and they share household operating expenses of the house in which they live. Bernie Bell has ownership interest in the house and receives a $1,300 real property tax bill for the 12-month period beginning June 1st. And then his sister that doesn't live with him loans him money towards some of that tax bill. So remember, taxes are part of shelter expenses. So the sister that's living outside the household is providing some of that help when it comes to paying for his shelter. So the sister gives them a loan of $400, and she pays that to the county to help with that tax bill. And the cousins pay the difference, which is $900. So what Social Security will do in the following is look at how much that in-kind support should be valued at per month over that 12-month period. So they take the tax bill of $1,300 and divide by 12 months, which means that the tax bill is $108.33 per month. And then what they'll do is they'll look at the in-kind support that the sister that lives outside the household provided. So they take the $400 and divide that by 12, which gives a balance of $33.33. So that's how much in-kind support is counted per month, and that's how much the client's SSI would be reduced by. Now, because there's two members in the household receiving SSI, Social Security will take that balance of $33.33, which is the $400 a month the sister provided towards her shelter costs, and divide it in two. And that gives a balance of $16.66 per month. So what that means is that each member of the household, the two cousins that are getting SSI, would each have their SSI reduced by $16.66 for the month for the next 12 months. That's the value of the in-kind support that they received. All right, so that's just an example of a situation where somebody may be helping pay for shelter costs that's not subject to the whole 1/3 reduction. If the clients in this case could prove that the value of the support that they received from their sister was less than the whole in-kind support amount. So I hope that makes sense to everybody. And if you have any questions, like I said, I can answer those after. So what's the procedure for rebutting a presumed maximum value? So Social Security would typically have to notify a client in writing when they find that they're subject to in-kind support. And what Social Security will typically do is interview a person, gather all the information about how much their housing and food costs are a month. They'll ask them how much they pay per month towards that cost, and then use those figures to kind of determine whether or not the client is meeting their fair share of expenses. Okay, so Social Security will typically send a letter saying, okay, this is how much we've determined that your SSI is going to be reduced by for in-kind support. If the client disagrees with the fact that they are not subject maybe to the whole 1/3 provision, or that the amount of support that they're receiving is less, they can get in touch with Social Security. Typically, they have 30 days from the date on the letter saying that they're subject to the in-kind support to get in touch with Social Security and say, hey, I disagree with the decision that you made on my case. I'm not subject to the whole 1/3 reduction because the amount of support that I'm receiving is less than that. And if the client can show evidence that the value of the support that they receive is less than the amount of in-kind support that Social Security is charging, then Social Security will just reduce the SSI by the actual amount of the support the client gets and not by the full 1/3. And the client would have to do that by contacting their local Social Security office and speaking to one of the claims reps. Social Security would probably ask for updated information on expenses and an updated statement from the client attesting to how much they pay per month towards food and shelter costs. And again, shelter costs is determined by taking the amount that the client pays for rent or mortgage, for utilities and property taxes. Anything that can be attributed to the running of the household for the month is included in those shelter expenses. Okay. So that's an overview of the two in-kind support programs. And I want to talk to you a little bit about ways in which the client can get their SSI payment boosted up, circumstances that might change their living situation. Number one, obviously, is if a client moves out of the household where they were receiving in-kind support, they move into their own household and they receive no outside help paying for their expenses, then obviously that would change their living arrangement, and Social Security would boost them maybe from $490 to the $735. Or if the client could show that they were meeting their fair share of expenses. So an example would be fair share for rent, mortgage, utilities, and food is, let's say, $500 a month. If a client can pay that $500 a month, they would be considered meeting their fair share of expenses and could have their SSI payment boosted up to the $735. So if they live independently or that they pay their fair share, then they can get the full arrangement. There's another agreement called a room or lodger agreement that the client can ask Social Security to consider to treat them as a household of one. So even if they're living in the household of another, they may be able to get the living alone rate meeting or providing that they meet the following criteria. All right, so the room or lodger agreement is kind of like a business arrangement between the person that's renting a room to the client receiving SSI, the homeowner, and the person living there. So the room or lodger agreement says that under this agreement, the person with a disability receiving the SSI pays a flat fee for rent and food costs that the homeowner would charge anybody living with them. So maybe the homeowner says, okay, well, I've decided that the person that's receiving SSI is going to pay me $600 a month. That's a flat fee that we've agreed on. The homeowner doesn't have to be a parent or a relative. It can be a friend or anybody else that the client rents a room from. And basically what the homeowner would say is, I've charged this person $600 a month, and that's the same amount that I would charge anybody renting a room for me. And then the room or lodger agreement also says that the person who is receiving the SSI, their name does not appear on any of the household bills, and they do not share any expenses with the homeowner. So basically, it's a business arrangement that says the person receiving SSI is paying a flat fee for room and board. We don't share any expenses, meaning the homeowner and the tenant, and the tenant's name does not appear on any of the household bills. So with an approved room or lodger agreement, Social Security could potentially treat the client receiving SSI as living on their own, even though they're living in the household of another person. And it might be a way for them to stop counting that in-kind support. So to request something like a room or lodger agreement, what they would have to do is submit a statement to Social Security attesting to what I just said. So saying that the client pays a flat fee for room and board, they don't share expenses with the homeowner, and their name doesn't appear on any of the household bills. And the person renting the room, the homeowner, would submit a statement to the client's local Social Security office in writing attesting to that. And I've included a link to the form that's typically used to request a room or lodger agreement. It's called Statement of Claimant or Another Person. And using this form, the client could potentially, and it doesn't seem to want to open for me. It worked when I put this handout together yesterday. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, it just took a minute. So I just wanted to pull this up and show you what the form looks like. Basically, it's a very straightforward form. So it's a statement of claimant or another person, and the client would put their name on the top, their Social Security number, and it says, understanding that the statement is for the use of Social Security Administration, I certify that. So in this space here, the person renting a room to the client with a disability would just say, I charge Joe Schmo maybe $600 a month. It's the same amount that I would charge anybody living with me, and we don't share any expenses. And Social Security would probably ask the client to also provide like a rental receipt or any other documentation showing that they did in fact pay that flat fee to the homeowner for the room that they rented for the month. And so with an approved room or lodger agreement, rather than charging any in-kind support, either the 1/3 reduction or presumed maximum value, the client could potentially get the full 735 SSI rate at that point. And the reason why Social Security does that is because they realize that in a lot of situations, because the SSI rate is so low, the maximum is 735, that it's not feasible for a client to meet their fair share of expenses on an SSI check alone. If they have no other income, a lot of times they can't afford to do that. And so this is just a way around that in-kind support rule to do a room or lodger agreement. And I didn't put this on the handouts, but if a couple is living in the household of another and not paying their fair share of expenses, like I said, the couple's rate, both people disabled, both people receiving SSI, is 1103. Social Security will count in-kind support the same way by reducing the SSI payment by 1/3, but it would be 1/3 of the 1103 that they would reduce the payment by, not the 735. Okay. All right, so let me open up the line for questions now, because I know people probably have a lot of them. You guys are in listen only mode, so if you have a question, just type it in the chat box. I'll just give people a minute to type. Okay, Denise says, thanks, that was very clear and concise. Well, I hope so. I know that sometimes the material can get confusing, especially if you don't deal with it very much. So I try to make it as straightforward as I can. And it only really took me 25 minutes to go through it. I always set these things up for an hour because I never know how many questions I'm going to get. Sometimes I don't use the entire time, but that's really all that I had. But does anybody else have a question? Okay, there was one other thing that I wanted to mention that I didn't put on the handout either, and that's about what happens if a person is receiving in-kind support and then they have to leave the residence temporarily where they're living. So, like, for example, if a client was living with a parent and then they went away for school or other kind of vocational training, or if somebody was living in the household of another and had to go to the hospital, what happens? So what would happen in a situation like that is that Social Security would still count the in-kind support that the person was receiving in the home that they were living in, even if they were temporarily absent. Because, like I said, it's a temporary absence where a client does intend to return home at some point. So as long as the client intends to return home when they finish their classes or upon stay in the hospital, then the in-kind support would stay the same. They would still continue to count the in-kind support that they received when they were living at home against their SSI. If it's a situation where it's a serious one, like say, for example, somebody was very ill and they went from a hospital to a nursing home, like a long-term care facility. At that point, the in-kind support that they received at home would stop because that's no longer a temporary absence. That's a situation where a client wouldn't likely be able to return home, and that becomes permanent at that point. So they would not be subject to that in-kind support anymore. What would happen in a situation where somebody was like in a nursing home or a long-term care facility where Medicaid was paying for a majority of their care? Their SSI check would actually go down. The minimum grant is $30 a month for people that are living in like facilities where Medicare is paying for at least half their care, Medicaid rather. And the reason why it does get boosted down is because their expenses are paid for by Medicaid at that point. So that's the difference between a temporary absence and a permanent one, depending on the client's circumstances. Okay, I've been talking for about a half hour now. Any last questions, concerns, or comments on the in-kind support? Okay, looks like Milton has a question. He asks, why would an ISM apply to retroactive SSI benefits that cover several years? If once informed of the SSI benefit the client reports, they would be paying rent. Okay, so that sounds like a situation maybe where the fact that the client was paying for those fair share of expenses was not documented correctly. Because if they did provide documentation that they were meeting their fair share, they should not be subject to the in-kind support anymore. That would be a situation where I would follow up with Social Security to determine exactly what they have on record in terms of what the client is paying in their expenses. Maybe it's an example that they are paying something, but maybe they're not paying their fair share and they would still be subject to that in-kind support withholding. But that would definitely be an issue I would address with the local Social Security office, just to make sure that what they have on record is accurate. Because that happens sometimes, where in a living situation changes, where people increase the amount of money they contribute to expenses, or maybe if they move out into their own place and they don't report those things to Social Security, or if it doesn't get documented correctly, the person will still be charged with in-kind support even though they shouldn't be anymore. So that could be a situation where it just wasn't wasn't documented correctly, and I would definitely follow up on that if I was the client, just to make sure that the SSI record is current in terms of expenses and what they pay. Oh, okay. Okay, I see. So he says, I was referring to cases where the client has no income, applies for SSI, but gets approved several years later. Once the SSI was approved, they paid the rent. Okay, so the reason why that would happen is because if you're talking about retroactive SSI, they're looking at the client's living situation in the past, and they would count in-kind support that the client received prior to actually getting the SSI benefit. So if they were like living with a parent or a friend or something that was contributing to those costs, that would apply to any retroactive benefit they would receive because they were not able to pay their fair share of expenses at the time. But now that they're on SSI, if they're paying their fair share, they should see that in-kind support end from the time that they were actually able to document that they were paying for those expenses. So that's why that happens. Okay, so Jennifer asks, does the flat rate you list on lodging have to be at fair market value to be accepted by SSA? It probably should, but I've had cases in the past where they've accepted a lower rate than the fair market value, as long as the homeowner is willing to certify that they charge the person with a disability the same amount that they would charge anybody else living with them, then Social Security should accept it. You know, that's one of those cases where Social Security would take the homeowner's word as long as they were willing to put that in writing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be as long as the homeowner is willing to certify that. But rumor lodger always should be put in writing. You know, somebody, could call up the 800 number and says, oh, I'm going to establish a rumor lodger agreement, and then it doesn't get documented right. I always suggest putting it in writing and going to the local office to make sure that everything's applied to the record appropriately. It's always the best way to do it. Any others? Okay, well, there are no other questions. I will thank you for your attendance today. And I will be getting a schedule out of additional trainings throughout the fall. I haven't really had a lot of time to put together a training schedule, just because I've had so many other trainings to do and so many other things going on lately. But I will be putting out a schedule. I want to do some additional trainings on things like Medicaid Works and 1619B. Did a training on those a long time ago, but I'm going to do an updated one for all the new WISs and new VR staff, because that's a question I get a lot. And there are a couple other work incentives that I want to touch base with you on also, like impairment-related work expenses, line work incentives, and PASS. It's been a long time since I've done training on those, and so I want to do those as well. So I will send out a training schedule to everybody once I have it finalized, with all the links to register for those. And I do want to start doing more trainings on a more regular basis, as time allows. So keep an eye out for those things. Again, VR staff on the line, if you want those CRCs, shoot me an email, and I'll be glad to make sure those get logged in for you. WISs, make sure you log this in for your continuing ed. Even though I didn't use the whole hour, I would still put a whole hour in. you can go ahead and do that because that's what you block the time off for. And any questions that you have that come up on in-kind support or any other work incentives issues, you can always call me 434-298-7652 or email me, Michael, M-I-C-H-A-E-L, .klinger, K-L-I-N-G-E-R, at dars.virginia.gov, and I would be glad to answer any questions you have. All right. I want to thank you all for your time and attendance and participation today, and I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.